being moderate is a green flag. You see this new one about extremist views? William shared the graph of it.
I haven't seen this one, but
let me get your take on this. This is awesome. Researchers polled over 1,000 registered US voters aged 18 to 34. A majority of both men and women consider far-rightism and far-leftism to be red flags in a potential partner. 76% of women and 59% of men consider identifying as a MAGA Republican to be a major turnoff. 64% of men and 55% of women said they'd also swipe left on someone identifying as a communist. So that was high number of women, 76% for MAGA, 64% of men for communist. 55% of women said that listening to Joe Rogan was a red flag.
About modern wisdom.
35, yeah, that wasn't on there. 35% of men. 41% of men said the same for a woman being into astrology.
Okay.
20% of women. 33% of men said red flag for they say Black Lives Matter. 14% of women. 53% of women for they refuse to see the Barbie movie. 53% of women. 58% of women for they say there are only two genders. So more women concerned about the two genders thing than the Barbie movie. Interesting what that is. But yeah, just overall, it seems like far-rightism, far-leftism, being moderate is a green flag, basically. Like having. But that being said, how is saying that there are only two genders like an extreme position? How like I would have thought that would have been the moderate position, right? Like, well, I guess it depends. Yeah, but the bar stool's been turned upside down. But yeah, overall, when it comes to dating, it seems like a majority of both men and women consider far-rightism and far-leftism to be red flags in a potential partner.
What age group is this? Are these young
18
people?
to 34.
18 to 30. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you've probably seen some of these data too about sort of the political divergence of young men and young women. Which is really, I mean, it's really interesting because a lot of the press, the media will concentrate on, the supposed right-wing radicalization of young men, when actually most of the sort of political psychology survey data indicates the reverse, where young men are slightly turning to the right. There's sort of a slight turn, whereas for young women, there's a sharp rise in young women identifying as left or far left. So it's actually the women who are being sort of radicalized or turning to a more extreme direction.
Yeah, but we don't mind about that one. We don't need to care about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I think like in terms of like violence and so forth, right? There's no young female syndrome, or if there is one, it would manifest itself differently. And
the female longhouse.
The longhouse. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the sort of the classic threats of terrorism and so forth, I mean, but yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so some of those, like, yeah, the two genders one, that's interesting.
58% of women.
58% of women. I found like there's a sort of a neat reversal there of like MAGA Republicans versus communists, where most men are seemingly okay with dating a MAGA identifying woman, but women are more okay with dating a communist identifying man.
But here's the thing, right? That it's not apples for apples, right? Like 35% of men said that a woman listening to Joe Rogan was a red flag, but a man listening to Joe Rogan and a woman listening to Joe Rogan is not the same thing.
That's true too. Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there was one about owning a gun. That like some quite high percentage of women said that owning a gun was a red flag, right? In America.
Yeah.
But a woman owning a gun is not the same as a man owning a gun, right?
Yeah.
And the same for listening to Joe Rogan and so on and so forth. So it makes for very interesting reading. But I actually think that like if a woman does listen to Joe Rogan, there'll be some non-zero number of men in there that are like, that's a boys' show. Like why like, oh, maybe she's super disagreeable, or maybe she's like going to try and arm wrestle me in bed or something. Like
yeah. I've heard this. Just speaking with young guys that, they are to some extent sort of bothered by these gender differences in politics and how like more and more young women are sort of identifying in a more sort of sharp left-wing direction. But then they also sort of lament that, a lot of because you have to be, to some degree psychologically peculiar if you're a young woman who is a sort of right-wing person or identifying openly as a conservative, because you're sort of going against the grain, right? Like you are an outlier in that sense. And that often sort of coincides with other things that young men are kind of annoyed by. And so it's like...
It's the astrology one, dude. 41% of men said that a woman being into astrology is a red...
That one was confusing to me. I think, like, that's fine. You know, that's like a
Rob,
to me, like a feminine way of thinking. You know, like, I think it's, you know...
I can't remember who was it that said... They said... the big five is astrology for men.
I've heard that for evolutionary psychology too.
Evolutionary psychology is astrology for men.
Yeah, but I mean, well, that's fine. But then, like, you know, a lot of men, but at least in my experience, more women are interested in the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs, and that is, I mean, it's, you know, it's not completely astrology, but it's more like astrology than the big five.
It is. So. I had Spencer Greenberg on the show. Do you know Spencer? Real interesting dude.
I think I've seen some of his...
I got intro to him from William McCaskill. Just super interesting guy, mathematician, but just does science. Like, I don't know what he's funded by, maybe himself, but... and he did a huge breakdown of, like, predictive power of Myers-Briggs versus Big Five versus other stuff. And Myers-Briggs is like, I think it's like 18% accurate, basically, on actual predisposition of things. But it is. That's astrology for astrology, I think. What was that study about higher female status and gender equality being associated with lower female relative to male happiness and relationship satisfaction and stuff like that? Yeah,
this was a study I came across. I think it was published in 2015, which essentially found that higher levels of wealth and socio-political equality among the genders is associated with lower levels of relative happiness for women compared to men. And the researchers speculate this may have something to do with increasing levels of employment, the pressure to obtain higher levels of education among women in particular, and that this is actually sort of dampening women's levels of happiness. And to me, this connects with another... and this one is, you know, this classic finding of the paradox of declining female happiness, which is essentially that since the 1970s, women's happiness relative to men's has declined. So to be clear, so relative to the 1970s, everyone is less happy today compared to the 1970s. But in the 1970s, men were actually happier. Women were happier than men.
Yeah.
So women had higher rates of happiness relative to men in the 1970s, and people generally were happier overall. Fast forward to the present, and things have reversed. Men are now happier than women, although overall people report being less happy. And so, that study that I pointed out, that was an interesting one to me because, I mean, the message that a lot of young people receive today is, what are the keys to happiness? You know, you work hard, you go to college, you get a degree, you get a high paying job, you sort of follow that cookie cutter track. And what is the purpose of all of this? And it's, you know, I suppose, you know, most people say, well, they want to be happy. And so you go through the education and employment route. Maybe you go to law school after college, you sort of get the credentials, you go through the fellowships and all these different programs. And at the end of the tunnel, you're hoping that you'll be happy. And actually, for both men and women, doesn't seem to be working, but for women in particular, because they've had the sharpest decline, right? Because remember, they were happier and now they're, you know, so
they're crossed over.
Exactly. And so they're, diminishing happiness has actually been sort of more pronounced relative to men. The men's happiness being sort of higher than women's is interesting as well, and I wonder if that is almost sort of the reversal in some ways. Of course, they're less happy overall, but why would they be happier than women? And I wonder if that's to some degree because they don't feel as much pressure anymore. The sort of you know, back in the day, men were sort of pressured more to be earners and providers and so on. And there was a sort of economic pressure associated with that. And now that you don't really have to work, I mean, we're seeing young men are sort of dropping out of college, they're dropping out of higher education and employment.
Yep.
And at least in the short term, depending on how the survey questions are presented, if it's just, you know, how do you feel generally or how do you feel today or what have you, I think a lot of you guys might be like, yeah, I didn't have to go to class
also,
today.
Given the fact that men were previously less happy and relative to then are now less happy. Also, it's just that really the big change here is the women, right? That's flipped.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder whether like the male dissatisfaction with the gainful employment, status seeking, providing thing was just baked in already. It's like, oh, okay, like we already knew this. Like granddad was spitting sawdust and he was unhappy, and dad was spitting sawdust and he was unhappy, and I'm spitting sawdust and I'm unhappy. But there is a little bit less pressure to do this. Was that Candice Blake that did that one?
The female happiness study.
Yeah.
I don't recall the authors of that one, but it was from the Journal of Happiness Studies.
She definitely taught me about either that or something similar, which is that the gender pay gap positively predicts relationship satisfaction.
Oh, I have seen that. Yeah. I think I read that paper, which is it's and it's funny because it predicts relationship satisfaction if men earn more than women, and then it also there was a reversal of this. I don't know if Candace was a study on this or different authors, but they found that when women in marriages earn more than men, that this predicts higher rates of arguments, of verbal aggression on behalf of the woman, of just general relationship dissatisfaction.
Higher rates of domestic violence.
Infidelity on the part of the man as well. Men are more likely to cheat when they earn less.
50% increase in the use of erectile dysfunction medication when the woman's the primary breadwinner.
I heard that too. That's pretty, I mean, it's grim, but then, here's an anecdote. I remember when I was in undergrad and I had this conversation. It was it was me and then like this group of women, these female students, and one of them, she was a pretty hardcore feminist, and she said that it should be 50-50. Like 50% of women should be working, 50% of women, if it's the case that 50% of women are working, 50% of women should be at home, and same for men. If 50% of men should be working, 50% of men at home. And then, so then I was basically just sitting back, like I was not going to get entangled in this. But then some of the other women were saying, okay, so, but like, would you actually be like okay with that? Like your husband staying at home? I don't really know, whatever. And then finally I decided to jump in, and I said, like, speaking to this young feminist woman, I said, yeah, so I know that you plan on going to law school. You're very smart. You're going to be very successful. Like, how would you feel like your husband is at home, I don't know, changing diapers and taking care of the kids, and you're at a prestigious law firm with a bunch of high-powered attorneys? Like, how would that, you think you'd be happy in that situation? And her response was, wow, I think I just felt a tingle when you said high-powered attorneys. Like, I got really excited when you said that. That was basically her reaction.
Wow.
And it was half joking but half serious. And all of the women laughed. I laughed too. I mean, it was a good response. But like, I think that there was an element of seriousness there, right? That like when she's sort of fantasizing about like, rubbing shoulders with all of these, high-powered, successful, at the top of their game, and then you got your husband at home. And I think it's different, right? Like it's men and women are different. We're attracted to different things.
Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that clip with Rob, you will love my full-length podcast with him, which you can watch right here. Go on, tap it.